Welcome to Conversations with Cox and Kielseth, and to be more specific, that is filmmaker Alex Cox and myself, film curator Pablo Kielseth. Alex will join us by phone from his home in Oregon, while I sneak away from my office to call him from one of the projection booths used by the International Film Series, which has been screening foreign and independent movies at CU Boulder since 1941. We will keep our chats to about 20 minutes as we discuss whatever movie-related topics grab our fancy.
Good doggies go, and no more with me will he roam. But if dogs have a heaven, there's one thing I know. Why, it's Pablo.
Alejandro.
¿Cómo andas?
Ando bien, ¿y usted, señor?
Muy bien, gracias.
I believe you wanted to sort of redress because we had a couple comments from people regarding it was our 69th podcast, and we decided to call it, or I told Jason he should just go ahead and call it Gun Porn, because our special guest, Alan Cadillo, cinematographer who was kind enough to join us, and he kept using that term over and over again for movies that he had shot. And then we got off on this whole thing about your Richard Jewell-like neighbors who we shouldn't be, worried about their arsenals, and progressives,
but making common cause with them, yeah.
Yeah.
What were the responses? I know what Jason's response was. What other responses did you get?
I think that there was a little bit of obviously I'm talking to you from Boulder, and we happen to really love our Priuses here. So you got to be careful when you talk about, painting progressives with one brush, just as well as you got to be careful about painting all conservatives as Nazis, as I think you mentioned. So
No, wait a minute. I didn't say either of those things. I didn't mention progressives. And I think that was the and I certainly didn't call anybody a Nazi.
All right. Well,
what I said that Jason took exception to was that I could be stranded at the side of the road and 150 liberals would drive by me in their Priuses and their Subarus. Uh-huh. Well, that's true. Yeah. But I was talking about liberals. I wasn't talking about extreme right-wingers with gun collections, and I wasn't talking about leftists or socialists.
Gotcha.
And so that's what I think is interesting, is that the discourse, both here and in England, and probably many other countries as well, is limited to two political parties, both of which are almost identical. One of which calls itself liberal and the other calls itself conservative. And so what would be interesting for me would be to expand the discourse a bit, so we go beyond that very, very narrow band of essentially neoliberals, neoconservatives, all of whom think more or less the same things, all of whom love war, and think what's really to the left of them is socialism, and to the left of socialism is communism, and to the left of communism is anarchism, and in the same way on the right. I mean, there are people who are more right-wing than the Republican Party, but I wouldn't necessarily characterize them with really abusive terms.
Okay.
So that's what I think is interesting. If we can find, perhaps through cinema and through the use of films that we've seen, maybe we can make a definition of the difference between the liberal, the conservative, the socialist.
All right, well, have at it. I'm putting it in your court.
Okay, but I know that you prepared something to discuss as well. So to establish the difference between a socialist and a liberal. Liberals love war. Liberals love banks, corporations, rich people. They never saw war they didn't like. And in theory, I didn't know this until I researched it. I used to think of myself as kind of an anarchist, but then anarchists can't agree on anything. So you have to reach some kind of a concord here. So I actually went and looked online at the Encyclopedia Britannica and the socialist view of war. And apparently, I didn't know this, not being a Marxist, but Marx said that war came about due to class issues, and that the capitalist state would always be driven to seek war to get raw materials, to get markets, and to get access to cheap labor. And in the case of true socialism, don't know if that's ever existed. The state would wither away. There would be no class. Everybody would be equal. And so there'd be no war, which is an admirable thing to seek if you're a pacifist or even an environmentalist or a conservationist. And so, thinking in those terms, I would suggest that a conservative film, we could say almost any American film made in the last 40 years, but let's choose American Sniper.
Okay.
Because American Sniper, directed by Clint Eastwood, thought of as one of the most conservative of directors. He only directed that film because he would do it for less money than Steven Spielberg.
I did not know that.
Spielberg was originally the director of American Sniper, but I believe he wanted like 35 million or more, and Eastwood would do it for 25 million.
Okay.
And so they picked Eastwood. And so that's the narrow gulf between the conservative and the liberal in Hollywood, is how big of a budget do they get? But essentially the viewpoint is pretty much the same. Well, what's to the left of that conservative film, but still not really a leftist film? What's a liberal film? And one could find a number of liberal films, the complete oeuvre of Robert Redford, But I would suggest Salvador, Oliver Stone's film Salvador,
okay,
as a liberal film, because although it depicts a colonial war of liberation, the attempts of the working class and the peasants of El Salvador to throw off the shackles of the oligarchy, it sees it through the perspective of two white male journalists. And of course, liberals love journalists as long as they, are reporting for the mainstream media. And they're not Julian Assange. And at the end of the movie, James Woods stands there as the battle draws to its conclusion, shouting at both sides, "You're just as bad as each other. You're just as bad as each other." And obviously it was something that was put on the back of his head in post-production. It was lines that were added probably at the behest of the financiers. But in so doing, it manages to kind of tear the guts out of the movie and render it pablum. So that would be pablum, not pablum.
Thanks for the clarification.
That would be an example of a mealy-mouthed liberal film.
Okay.
And for a socialist film, I would say It's a Wonderful Life. Surprisingly enough, a Hollywood film made just after the Second World War, but by a film director who definitely had some leftist or egalitarian inclinations, starring an actor who'd come back from active duty in the Air Force when he'd been totally wrecked by multiple bombing missions and had PTSD, Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah.
And they make a film which shows the difference between what that town would be like if it was left to the mercy of the banksters versus what it could be like if Jimmy Stewart, if good people like Jimmy Stewart could band together and achieve something.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's a socialist film.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
And what do you think? I mean, given that these arbitrary distinctions, but perhaps not so arbitrary, what do you think of?
Well, I mean, working backwards, in terms of socialist movies, we've mentioned I Am Cuba before, which we both admire a lot, and it's and
obviously that's a socialist movie. It's the story of the Cuban Revolution. And
then I was trying to think of I did a little a cursory search for some other titles. One that popped up because it was a blacklisted director. It was Salt of the Earth, which I have not seen. And you told me it's actually very boring, so I should not.
Oh, they made us watch that at UCLA because we had a print, and because all university professors are communists, right? So they made us watch Salt of the Earth. It's really boring and badly acted, and it has a warm heart and the best of intentions, but it's not. I Am Cuba.
And then there's all the Russian classics that might be a little too on the nose. And then I was thinking about some Iranian cinema, just because it actually gets down to the street level, and kind of follows just sort of normal working people, just like everyday folks, and it gets further away from sort of studio type movies. And then that was making me think less about the content, but more about the structure of a movie. One other a documentary that I do want to give a shout out to, because I love it. It's Agnes Varda's The Gleaners and I from 2000, and it's a movie, it's a documentary that basically looks into the lives of these gleaners, these people who basically make their living off of the stuff that has been, thrown away by the rest of society. And I think that's just it's got a lot of heart to it. It's very interesting.
Yeah. What country is it set in?
It's it's a French, documentary by Agnes Varda. So it's
yeah. So it's set in France. It's trash pickers in France.
Yeah.
Wow.
But then I was thinking about structure, because, It's a Wonderful Life. Of course, you were talking about the content. Totally get that. But what about structure? And I recalled there was a documentary that we screened at the International Film Series 10 years ago. And it was called Chain Camera. And the people who put the doc together, they gave video cameras to 10 high school students and told them to do whatever they wanted. And then they assembled the footage. And it ended up being actually a big success at the IFS. But what was interesting to me is that you're giving the tools of production right to the people who are representing their own lives, right?
Interesting.
And that to me is sort of a socialist endeavor. And then that also then made me think of something that came out 6 years later, which was a music documentary that was basically a Beastie Boys concert. And it was called Awesome. I fucking shot that. That was a 2006. They handed out a bunch of cameras to all these fans to record the concert. And it was assembled by one of the Beastie Boys, Adam Yauch, who passed away 9 years ago. And I thought, now that's another interesting example of the medium of production being given to the people, right?
Yes, and it's interesting what you say about structure, because of course the structure of American Sniper would have been exactly the same whether it was directed by Spielberg or by Eastwood, because the liberals and the conservatives share a common structure as well. Well,
but see, that's where we get to where and I have my own kind of hobby horse, I guess, on this particular topic, which is that I feel that the whole left versus right, it's a false choice anyway. You see, and I don't think it's about the coastal elites versus the heartland. For me, it's about the bottom 90% versus the top 10%, which is something that I felt that, I've basically been growing up my whole life seeing the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. And so for me, that sort of subject is that sort of class warfare subject is more of interest. And it kind of, because of the time I was growing up, I got a front row seat as a teenager with Reagan. And so the movies that I think of as conservative are the ones that are sort of like coked up Reaganism on steroids type 80s action movies. We're talking the Top Guns, the Rambos, the Terminator, Lethal Weapon, all those, they all have this weird hard body fixation that is still something. And I think we've talked, we might've touched on it before, but that hard body fixation is something that's gotten even worse now throughout time with the glut of superhero movies, which kind of took their place. Yeah. And so it's not just that the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer. It's the fact that big Hollywood blockbusters seem to go all in on this Leni Riefenstahl-like, hard body aesthetic. And so there's something fascinating to me about that, which is then why, as the counterpoint that I would give up to that, I would not list it as liberal. I would just list it as like counter Reaganomic or reactions to Reaganomics, or movies that were reactions to Reaganomics. And we've already talked about John Carpenter's They Live too many times, so we'll put that we'll put that one aside, but we both love it, and anyone who hasn't seen it should see it.
And that's definitely a film about class as well. The hero is a homeless person.
Yeah, and it's also it's a movie that just, my gosh, that's, well, anyway. But I was also thinking about Wes Craven's film, The People Under the Stairs, which is about evil landlords and some stolen children. And when I mentioned it to you last, I think you said, "Oh, that makes me think of Parasite," which is exactly,
of course,
which is exactly right. Now,
which is another film about class, isn't it? Because there are the guys in the big house, there are the guys who live in the basement and can't get an internet signal, and then there's the guy who lives under the basement.
Right? Yeah. And People Under the Stairs came out in 1991, which was the same year that Mary Herron's film or adaptation of Bret Easton Ellis's novel came out, which was of American Psycho, when that came out. So that, and American Psycho to me is basic. You basically have this incredibly rich Wall Street guy who goes around, totally misogynistic, killing homeless people. Again, it was savage when it came out because people took it literally as opposed to metaphorically. The other film that came to my mind was Stuck by Stuart Gordon, which was about a woman who hits an unemployed person with her car and then leaves him to die in her garage. And that was based on a true story.
Wow.
Yeah. And then speaking of Stuart Gordon, his chum, guy who worked with him on some other films, Brian Yuzna, basically his directorial debut was a film called Society. And that was 1989. That's a body horror film about an elite society that gets its kicks at the expense of the non-elite. It's definitely another good class warfare horror film. And I'm not surprised, actually, that your friend Adam McKay recently, I think, might have even recommended that on a short list of movies that he thought were worth people's attention. Adam McKay's own film, The Big Short, I thought did an excellent job of delving into a very similar topic. More recently, of course, we can thank Boots Riley for Sorry to Bother You. We can thank Jordan Peele for Get Out and Us. All of those are very good class warfare films. But for me, kind of like the granddaddy of them all would be George Romero, going back to the original Night of the Living Dead, as well as Dawn of the Dead. And then let's leapfrog up to 2005, where he did Land of the Dead, where the rich and powerful live in a luxury high-rise called Fiddler's Green, which cracks me up because I live here in Boulder, where there's this amphitheater in Denver called Fiddler's Green, surrounded by all kinds of tech industry and business towers, etc. Anyway, in Land of the Dead, the city is ruled by a ruthless plutocrat, and it stars Dennis Hopper. So these are, I guess, the ones that I would sort of point to as sort of interesting various versions of whether it be fiction movies or, as we mentioned at the very beginning, some documentaries that put the cameras in the hands of the people, that are interesting ways of approaching the topic of the differences that we have, the class divide that exists in the United States right now.
And being able to talk about class issues and to step outside the liberal conservative consensus under the guise of genre.
I mean, okay, let me ask you this. So because I think that you raise interesting points about the labels between like socialism and liberalism and this and that. But what about, are there terms that we could use that are totally very direct, not confusing, like haves and have-nots? Would that be a better way maybe to phrase this?
That's a socialist construction again, because you're taking class as the primary thing. And one of the ways, this is going to offend people too, you're going to get some more comments. One of the ways that the oligarchy divide us is through identity politics, is through ignoring class. And saying that, black people are suffering disproportionately from COVID, and Latinos are suffering disproportionately from COVID, which is a complete obfuscation. It's a class thing. They're suffering because they are poor. They live in food deserts. They can't afford to work from home, and they have no money, and they don't have health insurance. So it's all class. and we get sidetracked from that.
Okay, but that still seems to fall into the have-nots territory for me. But I mean, are you just saying that you just? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Have and have not is a class issue, isn't it? You're talking about the 90% who are pretty much have-nots by this stage, the 9% of the professional managerial class who guard the 1%, and make sure that the lid keeps kept on the 90%. Yeah. It's all class, and everything else is kind of a distraction.
I think we've reached a consensus, at least between you and I, sir.
But I wonder what Jason will think. I hope that I made that distinction because to call a leftist a liberal is a calumny, is a horrible calumny.
Well, I can't roll my R's to the dramatic effect that you can, but I do want to mention one more thing while we were talking about documentaries and class issues and haves and have-nots. I've been watching Exterminate All the Brutes, which is on HBO right now. And so for the people who just happen to have HBO, I guess you can see a documentary about haves and have-nots on that platform. But it's I'm still not done with it, so I don't want to talk about it. But it seems to be covering some of the same ground that you and I are very briefly talking about here in today's podcast.
I read a review of it, and I think that Todd has an HBO subscription, maybe, or one of those things. So maybe I can watch it too. But I read a review of it, and it seemed very interesting.
Well, if you do decide to check it out, maybe we can cover it on a future podcast. But I think we did a good job for covering our 20-minute fix for today. And I certainly, I'm always glad that you're up to the task of gabbing with me for almost a half hour. And
well, I'm glad that also that you're letting us stray into these areas about gun politics and class politics, because a lot of podcasts are pretty rigorously, oh, this is about movies, dude, and it's nice to talk about something that's got a bit more bite to it.
Well, I actually did on a semi-related topic, even though I program a calendar film series that normally takes place in a brick and mortar auditorium with 400 seats and now has been virtual. But back in the day, even though I'm here in Boulder, I had some people who approached me who said, there's this documentary that is basically something that would appeal to people for whom the Second Amendment gun rights issues is a big deal. And I gave them I said, all right, I'd be curious. I'd like to have a back and forth. And we had a special speaker and all kinds of promotions, and nobody showed up. It was just kind of fascinating to me.
How surprising.
Yeah.
Wow.
Anyway,
that's what do you attribute that? Why didn't people show up?
Well, I think that everyone's kind of, everyone's kind of already picked their side on that issue, and the people who are on one side just don't want to go see the other side talk about it, and the people on the other side didn't want to probably venture into Boulder. I don't know. It's a drive, So.
Well, because they fire policemen for hunting elk on duty in Boulder,
Oh, you were here during that thing. That happened on Mapleton, I think. Yeah.
Hey, and also shout out to Michael Casey, because doesn't he have a new book out?
Oh yeah. Well, we actually Michael Casey was kind enough to join the Z Brief last week, and I gave a little plug to his book.
Oh, plug it again.
Yeah, no. So Michael Casey, who's the film critic for the Boulder Weekly, and he just recently published a book that is about it's specific to Boulder County, a refreshing. I don't have the title right in front of me, but I think it's a refreshing history. And if you Google Michael Casey and his Boulder Weekly, you'll surely be driven to it. Anyone who listens to this knows that Alex and I enjoy sharing a beer while we talk to kind of compensate for the days when we used to sit out on the stoop and see the sun go down and enjoy a beer and talk about movies. And this is our sort of virtual stoop. Hey, now that's what we should be calling the podcast, Alex. Huh.
The virtual stoop.
Well, something akin to that. I mean, we'll think about it. But anyway, yeah, let's hope we might switch gears next week to talk about music, and we're always open to any topics that anyone wants to toss our way. So
keep those complaints coming in.
All right, Alex, thanks so much, and tell Todd I said hello.
I will. It was really nice talking to you.
All right, take care.
And cut. Okay, that's a wrap.
Thanks again for joining Alex Cox and myself today. I'd like to thank Jason Phelps for handling the audio and Ted Thacker for letting us use the intro to his song, The Ballad of Slim Cessna, for the musical cues that bookend these conversations.